What's the one thing almost every motorsports fan has in common? Sure, you could say things about how much the fans love the speed, or maybe even the noise the cars make as they fly past you. Deep down though, is that the core reason people watch motorsports? Some may think so, but I believe they have something else in common. If you look at social media, you'd think racing fans have nothing in common at all. That doesn't tell the entire story, thankfully, as thousands of fans band together weekly to watch these races take place live and in person. Not only that, but there are congregations of fans all around the world that group together to watch racing. But does that mean the sense of community is really the primary draw towards racing? No. The biggest commonality between all of us is that we likely have a race we consider to be our favorite. For most people, their favorite race is likely going to be a race they experienced when they were first discovering the sport. After all, motorsports enthusiasts became fans for a reason. They clearly enjoyed themselves watching a race. A lot of American motorsport fans point towards their first Indy 500 or perhaps their first Daytona 500, given their status as the premier event on their respective schedules. For F1 fans, some prefer Monaco for the same reasons, while others prefer their home country's race, or perhaps another track on the schedule with a long history. However, for the rest of the motorsports fan base, the same usually can't be said. Especially for those who've been watching for several years or decades, a lot of fans will look towards a race more recently in their fandom as their favorite. I myself am in this category of fan. My favorite race of all time is either the 2007 Daytona 500 or the Xfinity Charlotte Roval Monsoon of 2020, depending on how insane I'm feeling that day. However, using the 2007 race as an example, I was already watching racing in some capacity for nearly 10 years by that point. Now, to be completely fair, I was only a few months old by the time I began watching, so perhaps I'm an outlier to the rule. That doesn't change the fact that clearly something caused us to gravitate towards motorsports and these races in particular, but what exactly is it? I'd be willing to bet that a mutual interest in chaos is that key factor. And before anybody inevitably gets on their high horse and tries to say that insert blank factor is the real answer and that I'm wrong, at least give me a chance to make my case and address those points. There are many factors that go into a race being enjoyable. Cars that can pass one another and race hard for position, pit strategy, or Rick Allen's favorite thing.
Learn about anything.
We've got a problem.
The list goes on forever. A good race will ideally have all of these ingredients, as unrealistic of an expectation as that might be. But then again, if every race had all of these attributes, none would stand out as being good in the first place. Some people think intense, clean racing is the end-all be-all, and to their credit, that's undoubtedly one of the best parts of the sport. Despite that being a massive factor, and the one that the TV broadcast is most centered around, there are countless examples of races that featured great battles, some even for the win at the end of the race, that aren't regarded as highly as some of the other more common favorites. Take a look at the 2011 Advocare 500 at Atlanta, for instance. That race encapsulates everything you'd want from hard, clean racing. A worn-out track on Labor Day weekend? Hey, that sounds familiar. A fierce battle to the finish between two legends of the sport? What more could you ask for? Something clearly, given the fact that this race isn't as well remembered as some of its alternatives. Compare how little you see people reminiscing for this race online, with those nostalgic bait tweets and so on you'll see on Twitter every few weeks, versus literally anything that happened in 2014. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed 2014 too, but clearly 2014 offered something that particular Atlanta race in 2011 didn't. Fast forward a year to 2012. Hendrick and Roush were at the top of the world, while Stuart Haas, Penske, Joe Gibbs Racing, and MWR emerged as fierce competitors against the stranglehold those two teams had against the rest of the field. This is a season filled with parity, a field absolutely stacked with talented drivers. The sport's most popular driver even was competitive and even broke his 4-year winless streak. Hell, they'd even brought back pack racing at the super speedways. This is a season that seemingly had it all. Yet during the mid-portion of the season after a race at Richmond, none of those things were the story. Rather, questions like this were being asked.
Third straight race, there's been no wreck. I mean, does that amaze you? Have you ever seen anything like that?
David, only you'd think about stuff like that. I don't know about what you think of during the race, but I try to figure out how to win the race and make my car go fast. I don't sit there and think of that petty crap that you think of.
So, where does that leave us? It leaves us wanting the chaos that only motorsports can provide. Let's circle back to the 2014 season again. Yeah, this season had some great racing. It had its fair share of parity and even had historic moments. But most importantly, it had chaos. Bucket loads of it at that. Sure, not everything was great. Just ask all the people who had tires get cut down because of the teams pulling out the side skirts on a weekly basis. Nonetheless, the constant stream of interesting battles, coupled with the boatloads of chaos, were just enough to leave fans constantly satisfied and wanting to see more. Fast forward to today, 10 years later. Chaos might be the biggest area for NASCAR to potentially reclaim some of those fans it's lost over the years. I do want to give credit where it's due, and in some regards, they have improved at this. Ever since the pandemic, it seems like NASCAR has been way more likely to make changes. Since 2020, places like COTA, the LA Coliseum, and Bristol Dirt have been added to the schedule, tracks that undoubtedly bring an element of chaos with them. Next season's going to be more of the same, as they're going to be returning to Mexico City and hosting the Clash at Bowman Gray. Atlanta even became a super speedway since then and got a second race back. And that's not even taking things like the Chicago Street Course into account, which is an entirely new genre of racetrack that hasn't been seen in the modern era for NASCAR's top 3 series. But is this philosophy too NASCAR-centric, or does it apply elsewhere too? Take IndyCar into account. Fans still pine for tracks like Auto Club, Michigan, and even Pocono to return to the schedule, despite the fact that these tracks can be relatively unsafe for open-wheel cars. The Indy 500 is hosted every single year on a 2.5-mile track, where speeds can reach up to 240 miles an hour entering turns 1 and 3. The cars are always on the absolute edge of control, and disaster and unpredictability are only a moment's notice away. In F1, just look at any race lately where Max Verstappen is facing adversity of some kind. That added chaos and unpredictability open up the floodgates of possibility, and suddenly fans become a lot more interested in the race. Taking this all into account, what's lacking from the modern product in regards to its unpredictability? For those who follow me on Twitter, you know how much the restart zones not being on the front straightaway at all the road courses is a pet peeve of mine. Turn 1 after the start of restart is always the most exciting part of any race, but even more so at road courses where the turn 1 is usually a huge braking zone and passing opportunity. Sure, there can still be chaos as is, but it seems counterproductive to me to neuter one of the best parts of every race. So, why did they make this change? Well, look no further than all the fans who complained about the 2023 race at COTA that had 3 green-white checker attempts. Sure, it got a little silly at the end, and some of the pace laps at COTA take a really long time, but it was one race. One race had a messy finish, and the consequences of all the people complaining had a negative effect on every single road course race since then. At a certain point, the greater good, so to speak, would have been just to accept the chaotic race for what it was and to move on. Similarly, look towards this season's race at Nashville that had 5 overtime attempts. Yeah, that was a lot, but a meme race from time to time is a good thing. While they definitely got busy tearing up some of the cars at the end of that race, it was unquestionably exciting and unpredictable, something that 90% of the races on the calendar aren't. That's not to say that races should be like Nashville, but every once in a while a race like that is refreshing and can rejuvenate a stagnating season. Fast forward 3 weeks to the 2024 Brickyard 400, where what could have been a triumphant return to the oval turned into a controversial PR disaster. As annoying as the situation with Brad running out of fuel was, and the 5 being handed the lead and essentially the win for free, they did technically follow their rules and call that correctly, so I can't give them too much grief beyond perhaps reconsidering how restarts work in the event the leader runs out of fuel. On the contrary, what happened next deserves every bit of anger and vitriol sent its way. On the ensuing restart, the 41 of Ryan Preece got spun and crashed off turn 2. NASCAR, instead of following its own rules, caved under the pressure of all of those who complained about the Nashville finish and instead waited over half a minute to throw the caution in order to prevent another green-white checker attempt. So not only did the 5 inherit the lead for free, he also got a free pass in regards to a second overtime attempt. In the sake of fairness, it's very likely that Kyle Larson was going to win that race either way, with or without the green-white checker. But a win essentially being given to someone for free is a really, really bad look. There are other examples of this behavior in the past, but that's another conversation for another day, so I'll leave you with this. The next time you watch a race that's on the precipice of being great, but isn't quite there, think to yourself about what's missing. I'd bet the most common answer is a lack of chaos.